There is so much news right now about gun policy in the U.S. and gun rights. So I thought we should ground this conversation in some facts and data, and no one better to bring that to us than Sasha Anderson. Sasha is the Data Partnerships Manager at USAFacts. USAFacts is, as you by now should know, a nonpartisan, nonprofit civic organization that's dedicated to making government data accessible to you and me. They are a News Not Noise content partner. Sasha, I'm so glad to have you here today to talk about this because there is so much going on, and these conversations are far more substantive when they're grounded in the facts. So first, I wanted to start off by asking about the number of firearm deaths in the U.S. We know that number has been increasing, but would you help us break that down? What percent of those deaths by gun are suicide versus homicide?
So the government data is a little bit out of date, but we have data for 2020. And in 2020, there were 45,222 gun deaths. That is actually a pretty significant increase from 2019. So 15% increase, or about 5,000 additional deaths. That has been trending upward over time. And the slight majority of gun deaths are due to suicide. So in 2019, suicides accounted for about 60% of gun deaths. That dropped in 2020 down to 54% as homicides increased. So we are seeing generally a trend upward over time and an acceleration starting in 2014. It can be interesting to look at the data by state as well to think about where are these deaths happening and where is it changing. So two states where gun deaths grew the most in the last 40 years are Texas and Florida. You might think, well, those are just two very populous states. Of course, they had more deaths over time as the population grew. But the two states that had significant decreases were also high population states, so California and New York. And then the vast majority of gun deaths are in metro areas.
That's so interesting. So the states that have the most gun deaths also saw the greatest decrease in gun deaths. They also have had the most restrictive gun laws, at least until now, I believe. So I always hear the U.S. has more guns in private hands than any other nation. So I really want to find out if that's true, how many guns there are in the U.S. I'll tell you the data I've seen is that about 40% of Americans have guns, and that there are roughly 390 million guns in the U.S. in private hands. The average gun owner owns 5 guns. Can you verify that, or what stats are you able to confirm?
Yeah, so at USAFacts, we publish government data and make it easy to access for the American public. We actually can't confirm those numbers using government data. So what we do have from the government is data on licensed firearms. That's a small subset of firearms. There's a number of exclusions. We get that data from states. Not all states report, and then we aggregate that to get a total. So that total is somewhere around 7.5 million licensed firearms. We know that's a significant undercount. So if you compare that to the 390 million figure, we know about just about 2% of those guns.
So if that other stat is correct, about 380 plus million guns in private hands are not licensed. I know you can't confirm that because you can't confirm that that original number is correct, but wow. Pausing on that. Okay, moving on. The gun industry in the U.S. is a very healthy business, shall we say. The market selling guns to people of all ages is returning very attractive profits. Now, I imagine you're probably not able to get data on the actual dollars, but can you give us a sense if gun sales have changed in the recent past?
This is a really interesting question. So we have data on guns that are manufactured in the US, which we can use as a proxy for gun sales. So over time, it has generally hovered at or a little below 4 million a year. However, that's been increasing. And so we're now at closer to 8, and in a couple years recently, 10 million guns manufactured per year. Now, I want to pause on that because a very logical follow-up question would be, well, are they exported, right? Are they staying here? Are they sold here? Are we just sending them elsewhere? And the data shows that we export about 300,000 guns per year. I mean, it varies year to year, but roughly right around there. And so by and large, the guns manufactured here are not being exported.
So the vast majority of guns made in the U.S. are sold in the U.S.
And we also import an additional 7 million. For
A year?
in the last, a year. In the last year of data, it was 7 million, and it's generally roughly right around there.
So the total per year is what did you say? How many guns are made in the U.S. each year?
Right now, it's really around 8 million per year on average.
So if you add in imports, that would be 15 million roughly circulating new guns in the U.S. each year.
Minus 300,000 exports.
For the exports. Okay, so let's get into some of the policy issues that are in the discussion currently. Congress is getting close to passing a compromise gun safety bill. For some people watching this, that probably will already have happened when you see this, presumably. But that bill does not include an assault weapons ban. Now, we did have an assault weapons ban that was passed in 1994, and it existed for 10 years. And I'm curious, what does the data say? Does it show whether, while that was in effect, we were safer, that gun deaths went down, or do we even know?
So we can't draw a direct correlation, but we can talk about what the patterns in the data are. So we had a couple of laws that came about in the 90s. We had the Brady Act, which instituted background checks. And then, as you mentioned, we had the assault weapons ban that ran from 1994 to 2004. Over that time period, we saw a 25% decrease in gun deaths. So it definitely did go down and has been trending upwards since.
So I just want to say, you can't say because the data doesn't prove cause and effect. But the data does show that in the years where there was an assault weapons ban in place and after the Brady bill, there was a decrease in gun deaths for that period.
Correct, and pretty significant. So a 25% reduction, and we are now higher than our previous historical high. So in the early 90s, before either of these pieces of legislation.
So I would interpret that as saying, when the assault weapons ban was in place, there were fewer gun deaths. After the assault weapons ban expired and was not renewed, gun deaths again rose. You can't draw the causal link, but we're smart enough to make some conclusions based on that. So the Supreme Court has just weighed in on regulating gun permits, and that goes to all these issues about regulations, what the government does. How does the U.S. regulate who has access to firearms?
We have regulations at the federal level, and then, of course, states and localities make their own policies. So we, of course, have the Second Amendment, which guarantees the right for Americans to bear arms. And then we have the Gun Control Act of 1968, which regulates possession of firearms. So some of the common, federal restrictions are age. So you have to be 18 or older. In many places, that limit has been, or that minimum has been raised to age 21. And then we also have background checks that are now required, not for all gun purchases, but for some.
Can you tell us what's the system that people use to do background checks?
Yeah, it's the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. This was instituted in 1998.
Okay. And how many background checks are there every year?
On a yearly basis, for the most recent year we have data, 2019, there were 39. Oh, excuse me. It was actually 2021, I believe. But the most recent year, we had 39 million background checks. And over time, since the system was implemented, we've seen 300 million background checks happen and had 3 million denials. So 1 in every 100 people that have applied for a license to have a firearm have been denied under the national background check system.
I mean, all this math doesn't exactly add up. If you compare the number of guns that might be in circulation to the number of background checks compared to the number of guns that are federally licensed, it suggests that there are a lot of guns out there that might not be connected to background checks. I guess if they're not licensed firearms, then there's no check?
Correct. So there are ways that you can purchase without doing a background check, including private gun sales. But I also want to caution with those numbers that in some states, when you have certain licenses, like a concealed carry permit, you undergo a background check every month. So those numbers can be quite high as the same person is checked multiple times.
Ah. And so some of those background checks are duplicates for the same person. Important to note. You also mentioned that there are ways around this. Would you talk about that again? How do you get around a background check?
So there are private gun sales that are happening person to person, and some gun shows. It really varies depending on the state. So I'm sure there are a lot of, I'm sure we'll hear in the comments, different cases for different states and the situations where you can do a purchase without a background check.
Right. And so if you go into certain gun shows in some states, you can just go in and buy a gun and that's it. That's what they've called the gun show loophole. to a large extent. That's been a problem for a long time. Okay, can you tell us currently who is prohibited from owning a gun? In other words, background checks screen out which categories of potential gun owners, and does that vary by state?
So we have broad categories that are prevented. I pulled a little list for us. So we have convicted felons, people under federal domestic restraining orders, people convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence crimes, specifically against victims they were married to or had a child with. So we'll come back to that and the boyfriend loophole hopefully later. But people committed to a mental health facility or a court has ruled mentally unfit, fugitives, and people convicted of drug crimes.
So there's also different state rules about red flag laws saying that, in particular states, you can have a gun taken from somebody if they have a mental health issue. You also rate, and there's this, that's a component of the legislation that's moving through Congress, beefing up the ability for states to do that. You also mentioned the boyfriend loophole, and closing that loophole is included in this bipartisan legislation in Congress. Would you talk about the boyfriend loophole?
It was originally constructed, and it just called out spouses or when two people had a child together, and then if one partner had a restraining order, they were restricted from having a firearm. But it didn't cover people that you might be dating, not necessarily living with, not have property or children in common with. And so the boyfriend loophole, by closing it, it would restrict anyone with a domestic violence order for intimate partner violence against them from owning a gun.
And I know that gun safety advocates consider closing that a major, major win. They say that alone will save lives in their view. So you know a ton, and there's a ton of data available, but there's also some glaring gaps. And I'm wondering what kind of data on guns would be easy for the U.S. to collect that isn't currently collected, and why?
So as I was looking into this data, I asked our team of analysts, hey, what data would you love to have to be able to communicate to the American public more clearly about the gun situation in America? Some of the responses that I got were, of course, as we discussed earlier, just the total number of guns and how many of them are purchased each year. It would also be great to know specific types of guns. We do know some broad categories, but greater specificity there on the types of weapons and where they are located would be helpful. And then lastly, we think it'd be really interesting and helpful to have data on gun storage, right? Because a big piece of this is responsibly owning firearms. And do we know what kind of equipment people generally have and how many guns can we estimate are stored safely versus unsafely? Where are they to potentially target programs to increase safe gun storage?
And would it be easy to collect that data? You'd include it in a household pulse survey, which is a term I've learned from you, or how would that be done?
Yeah, we could absolutely collect that data in a variety of ways. So survey data is a great way to do it. So in any of a few different surveys that are run nationally by the census, that could be great. And then also we could we would have to implement systems to be able to track more closely, gun owners and where those guns are. But in databases, you could use that to then, create some data that's generated through a general tracking system.
I mean, the government knows every single vehicle you own, right? You have to register every car and vehicle and boat. At the very least, they should know how many guns there are. That's my point of view. I know it's not your position to have a point of view, but I'm grateful as always, Sasha, for this helpful and important information. Thank you so much for taking the time to gather this data and for sharing it with us.
Really interesting conversation. So thank you, Jessica.